such a great pleasure to welcome all of you to this discussion at the Institute for the Study of War. I'm Kim Kagan, the founder and president of ISW. It's wonderful to have you here today. And it is also truly wonderful to be able to welcome an expert speaker on a topic that is new and different to what ISW has been doing within its research portfolios, but critical to the national security and economic prosperity of the United States. And so today, it is wonderful to introduce to you a fabulous guest. Let me go over some housekeeping rules just before I do those introductions. The first portion of this webinar is on the record. And so we really appreciate it and want to let you know that we are recording right now. And then we will turn to some terrific questions and answers in a moderated discussion between our distinguished guest and ISW's research director, Matt McInnis. Let me introduce Matt first. I know some of you know him very well. Matt joined the ISW team in March of 2021 after serving in the Department of State with Secretary Pompeo, working on the full suite of the Iran portfolio. Matt is a career defense intelligence officer from DIA. We met Afghanistan's on the mind. We met in Iraq in 2007, and we were thrilled to work together, friends on many issues. It's wonderful to have him directing ISW's research efforts and our portfolios, ranging from the Middle East to Russia to Afghanistan to China. Matt is truly a very special addition and brings a great deal of professionalism to our work. And he will be moderating the questions and answers today with our distinguished guest, Eric Farnsworth, who has had an incredibly distinguished career. He is the vice president of the Council of the Americas, and he's based in Washington, D.C. And he has had a distinguished career in public service. He has really grown the Council on the Americas since really taking charge of it in 2003. It is really one of the most interesting and influential organizations working on this subject that is, as I said, so critical to us. But Eric Farnsworth has had an amazing career. He's had government positions in foreign policy and foreign trade. He's worked in the Western Hemisphere Affairs at State. I love State Department names. They're really good. And at the office, working to the Office of the Trade Representative. And he's done an incredible job also as 3.5 years as a senior advisor to the White House Special Envoy for the Americas. He's also had a distinguished private sector career. And of course, as befits anybody with these incredible accomplishments, you know that he had a wonderful start. And I want to flag in particular that he had started his academic life as a Truman Scholar. We have Truman Scholars in our ISW family, and we're really, really proud of all of them, and a number of other really distinguished programs. So we are thrilled to have Eric here with us. Let me turn over first to Eric and then to Matt for this wonderful conversation. We're so thrilled to have all of you here with us.
Kim, let me just say thank you for that terrific introduction. I think it just means I can't really hold a job for more than a couple of years at a time. But really quite generous. But the pleasure is mine to join you and your outstanding group. What you've done with the Institute as the founder and really turning it into a huge voice on these issues in Washington and internationally is really something to behold. And it's great to be able to talk to an audience that has a broader perspective than just the Western Hemisphere, to try to fit some of these issues into a global perspective. And from my view, to try to show the importance of the Western Hemisphere to the broader strategic agenda that we're all wrestling with. I hope not to have to talk about Afghanistan, but I suppose I could try that if you want. But there's so much going on in our own hemisphere, and I look forward to having the opportunity to visit with you and your folks. So thank you for that very generous introduction.
Well, Eric, you're welcome, and I should let all of the great supporters and friends on this call know that they will be receiving an invitation to a conversation on Afghanistan next week, so that we can stay focused on this particular subject. And we look forward to hearing from you and Matt. Matt?
Thanks, Kim, and thanks, Eric, so much for joining us today. One of the first questions that we were thinking, to tee off here is, really, what is the strategic importance of Latin America to the U.S. right now, and in particular, how do you see the Biden administration fitting in Latin America, or focusing on Latin America in their first few months in office?
How much time do we have for this conversation? No, it's a great place to start. Let me take it in kind of two pieces. The first is the immediate, and the second is the broader aperture. The immediate, of course, is the crisis du jour, and there seems to be one du jour. We start with Haiti and the earthquake, and before that, the assassination. We start with Cuba and the protests that began in earnest on July 11th, which really are the most serious threat, I would say, to the regime, at least since the Varela Project at the early part of this century, and maybe since the regime first came to power in 1959. We include the tremendous collapse of Venezuela, which has created and caused the worst humanitarian crisis in the modern history of Latin America, with 20% of the entire population of Venezuela now outside of the country as refugees. And we include a border crisis in terms of migration from Central America primarily, but not exclusively. We now see migrants coming to the southwest border from all parts of the world, frankly, to try to get into the United States. And not to complicate our lives too unnecessarily, but we're all doing all of this in the midst of a global pandemic, which is facing Latin America in the worst part, more significantly than any other part of the world. And I say that not because the Delta variant is particularly, more virulent in Latin America than in, say, Africa, but just the number of deaths, the number of cases, the collapse of the economies in some way has been more severe across Latin America and the Caribbean than in any other part of the world. So this is a region that demands attention, if for no other reason than it literally shows up on our borders when things aren't going well. So from the immediate perspective, the strategic interests from the United States perspective is protecting our own homeland, not from Latin Americans. That's not the point. In fact, we have a huge population of Latin American migrants in the United States, and they contribute meaningfully to the United States economy, to our culture, to our history, and have been 50% of the growth in the last 10 years of the US population, according to the census figures that just came out. But rather, some of the problems that are in the hemisphere will challenge us and do challenge us if we don't engage meaningfully to try to address them. So I think that is the first point. I think the second point then is the broader strategic lens, which Washington is terrible looking at Latin America and the Caribbean through, let's be honest. And it's for a variety of reasons. There are no nuclear weapons in Latin America. That's a good thing, right? Nobody wants the introduction of nuclear weapons into Latin America, but we don't have the same sort of violence in the context of state-to-state violence that we see in other parts of the world. Americans generally aren't targeted the way they are in other parts of the world. We just don't have the same sorts of conflicts and issues that impact at the state level. And so we don't look at Latin America necessarily through that lens, but I would argue that we have to. We have to begin to, whether it's through the violence that does exist in the context of the drug wars and the incredible lack of personal security in many cities and regions of Latin America and the Caribbean. In fact, if you look at the top 20 most violent cities in the world, at last count, 17 or 18 are actually in Latin America, which is an astounding statistic. But also we face a global strategic challenge that we didn't face over the last, well, since the end of the Cold War. I hate saying since the end of the Cold War because it's such a cliche, but it's really true. We didn't have a strategic challenge until the rise of China in the Western Hemisphere. And I've written and I've said many times that in my view, China's entrance into the Western Hemisphere has been the most dramatic shift, the most consequential shift in hemispheric issues this century. And we have to remember, we're only talking less than 20 years here. But China has now become the top trade partner of almost every country in South America, and is the top trade partner of a number of other countries in the region as well. And if it's not the top trade partner, it's generally the second partner to many of the countries. So you have a real economic and trade and investment issue, but you also have now a real political challenge in the region, that is, the United States is perceived to be less involved, less interested, and perhaps even less capable in the Western Hemisphere. You also have a China which is emboldened worldwide, has the tools to be able to engage worldwide in a way that simply didn't exist before cyber and before other activities made engagement possible. And you have Chinese ambitions in emerging markets that have really found real expression in the Western Hemisphere. So if you take all these things together, it's a region that is in play, where we once thought perhaps that democracy was here, it was secure, and that the United States and Latin America and the Caribbean were going to evolve and implement a common agenda for all time. I think that assumption is now under real challenge. And we have real competitors in the region in a way that we simply didn't have at the beginning of this century. So you wrap all those issues into one, and I suppose you could put others in there too, but it becomes a real, from my perspective, strategic issue that really demands higher level, more sustained, more concentrated focus from senior U.S. policymakers.
Thanks, Eric. I mean, that's a great overview of the region and why it matters. If I can go more specifics about some of the recent crises we've had in the Caribbean, as you noted, in Cuba, we've had some of the most dramatic protests against the government there in Havana that we've seen in perhaps decades. A lot of that is driven, as we know, by the spread of social media. And in the last few years, Cubans have been able to get access to the internet on their phones finally. And you also look at the crisis there in Haiti after the earthquake, after the assassination of the president. You have populations in both countries that are really looking for a way forward, looking to the U.S. potentially for help. How could we best help the people right now in both Cuba and Haiti?
It's a real challenge, and clearly a very good question, very timely question. In the immediate term, we have to do what we can to assist with the humanitarian needs of the people of Haiti in particular. And I know that the administration is doing that. USAID was early on the ground with assessment teams and moving humanitarian assistance into the country. There was an article just today on the front page of the Washington Post arguing that somehow people in Haiti are wondering if the country is cursed. That's their word, not mine. But it's relevant. I mean, you have assassinations, you have earthquakes, and right after the earthquake, you have delusion floods. I mean, this is a country that can't catch a break. Meanwhile, it is, according to virtually every statistic, that's kept by the World Bank and others, the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. So, I mean, the country is kept afloat literally by foreign assistance and remittances, and by massive NGO attention in the country. So it's a country that just doesn't have strong governance, and when it gets thrown off its axis by issues that are completely out of its control. In other words, natural disasters, which seem to hit frequently, it just continues to set the country back more and more and more. But it also has problems in terms of gangs, and it has problems in terms of economic and business climate, just abject poverty. So, I think we have to be mindful, we, the United States, have to be mindful of the humanitarian crisis that Haiti finds itself in. Over the longer term, I don't know that there is an answer here. I mean, the United States have been asking this question for a long time. We've had Marines in the country in the 1920s and 30s. We've had under UN auspices, we've been part of multinational forces as recently as a few years ago, led by Brazilians and Canadians and others. We've put billions of dollars into the country in terms of aid. We've done training and assistance. We've promoted investment through favorable policies, unilateral policies that the United States has with Haiti to try to encourage investment. And it just seems that nothing takes root. And if you look at the country that's immediately next to it and shares the same island of Hispaniola, the Dominican Republic, you have a totally different experience in terms of the economy and in terms of organization of society and things like that. It's not to say that the DR is perfect, it's not, but it's in contrast to Haiti, it's light years difference. And so, I think there has to be some sort of issue there in the context of governance. And so then that goes to the question of, well, who killed the Banana Man? And the Banana Man is what he called himself, right? Jovenel Moise. He was assassinated, and as everybody knows, and that is going to most likely, at least on current analysis, be a case that goes unsolved. And so if you have the assassination of the leader of your country, and the country was already in political ferment anyway, go unsolved or unresolved, or the actual authors of the crime, if not the perpetrators, go unsanctioned and not brought to justice, you have a lawless country. And that's exactly what a lot of people are fearing. And so we face the prospects, perhaps, of another surge of folks from Haiti trying to come to the United States. I was in the State Department in the 1990s during the last Haitian surge of migration, 1994 timeframe, and we didn't have good answers for it then, and we probably don't have great answers for it now. And so this is an issue that when I subsequently went from the State Department to the White House in the 90s, I advised folks, my own principal there, who I was working with, who had a hemispheric mandate, and wanted to know where should the priorities be. I said, well, let the bureaucracy handle Haiti, because there's no political upside to dealing with this. And I think that remains the same in the context of the United States. People work with Haiti when they have to, but it's a complicated agenda. And despite the goodwill and the massive amounts of assistance and support, we haven't found anything that works. It really has to be the Haitian people themselves to find a path forward. And so I think ultimately that's an answer, but it's also a trite answer, because, what does that mean, right? So it's an issue that from the US foreign policy perspective has to be managed. I think in the Cuba story is a lot different for obvious reasons, but this is a story that seems to be not going away. In the past, when you had protests against the regime, they were quickly put down, often brutally, or at least taken off the headlines. The Cuban regime is very good at oppressing its own people and has all kinds of techniques on ways to maintain power and control. What you have different this time is a new leader who's not named Castro. Raul Castro is still there. Some people would say he's still the ultimate authority on the island, and I agree with that, but the face of the regime at this point is Miguel Diaz-Canel, who does not have the same charisma, does not have the same story, does not have the same base of political support as either Fidel, certainly, or Raul, and has a heavy hand in terms of dealing with his own citizens who are just wanting to have a better life. And situation on the island is pretty desperate right now, according to reports. And people are just sick and tired of being sick and tired, to coin a phrase. And so they, newly empowered through social media and access to the internet, are finding ways to show their displeasure with the regime and say enough is enough. So you have a movement that's really organic, because the Cuban regime has really done very well in terms of removing potential and existing democratic leaders or people who would be leaders of those sorts of movements. It's really developed organically around the island, and it's proving difficult to eradicate. The question then becomes, what can the United States, what should the United States do? And obviously, I think it's in our interest to support democracy in Cuba, and certainly our lives and the lives of many across Latin America would be improved if you had a democratic election and a democratic government in Cuba. But we face a challenge because the instant that the United States becomes engaged in any particular way, the Cuban regime is expert at turning that against us and putting the focus, the spotlight on Washington rather than where it belongs, which is on Havana's gross negligence and failures in terms of governance. And that's something we always have to be aware of, because the story shouldn't be about Washington. The story is about Cuba and the need of the Cuban people for change and the desire of Cuban people for change. So we have to be judicious in what we do. I've actually been supportive of the Biden administration's approach to Cuba. I think that they've handled it just about right. I mean, there are things that we can be doing, providing internet access and some messaging and these sorts of things. But there are limits in terms of what we can do to support change on the island in Cuba. And I think we have to be mindful of that, again, so that we don't become the story. So it's a delicate dance. And then when you throw politics in the mix, particularly South Florida politics and these sorts of things, it becomes even more complicated. Again, it's like Haiti, it's an issue that really needs to be managed in some way. And one hopes that we can continue to do that effectively.
Thank you. And I think we're going to circle back on some of the more specific endemic challenges in both countries. But I wanted to bring in, the difficulties there in Venezuela right now. And in particular, we've seen, during the first few months of the Biden presidency, that Maduro is, obviously trying to find ways out from U.S. sanctions. He's coming, looking to come to the table. What should we be demanding from him before any major relaxation of sanctions? And can you also touch on the relationship between Iran and Venezuela right now? And does that pose a threat to the United States and our security?
Yeah, these are great questions, and it's very au courant to discuss, U.S. should lift sanctions and, reward Maduro for, goodwill efforts to try to get negotiations going with the opposition, which began just last Friday, August 13th. Friday the 13th. I hope that's not a harbinger of success or not. But being more serious, there is negotiation process underway, and the instinct of many observers is for the United States to support that as much as possible. And I think that that's true, but, and this is a huge but, it's not up to the United States to determine the success of negotiations. This is a negotiation between Maduro and Juan Guaido and the interim government recognized by the United States and many other countries around the world as the legitimate government of Venezuela, according to Venezuela's own Hugo Chavez era constitution. And therefore, the United States sanctions are not an incentive for progress in negotiations. They are put there and should be removed if and when the conditions on the ground in Venezuela merit their removal. And so the question that you're asking, Matt, I think is exactly right. The sanctions are put on for, well, there are two levels of sanctions. The first is against individuals like Mr. Maduro and leaders of his regime and individuals who have been credibly accused of human rights abuses. And these are for illegal activities, whether it's for human rights abuses, whether it's for gross corruption. I mean, the regime has stolen literally hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars from Venezuela. And so the sanctions are against individuals for those criminal and illegal acts. There are sanctions against the economy, which is primarily the oil sanctions, which were put on in early 2019 on PDVSA. which restricts the ability of the United States entities to work with PDVSA, which is, of course, the national oil company in Venezuela, and to restrict PDVSA's ability to get oil onto the international economy. There are some financing restrictions and various other things as well. And so the first category of sanctions probably aren't going to be lifted other than a law enforcement process or some sort of amnesty that might come if indeed there's a negotiation to come to some sort of accommodation with the opposition. The sectoral and economic sanctions were put on to try to restrict the income flows to the regime, which then again either steals the money or uses it to pay off the security forces, et cetera, to maintain itself in power. So the idea was if you can choke off that oxygen to the regime, they'll have less resources available to pay off the security services. At some point, the security guys recognize that they're getting a raw deal and they turn against the regime, and you have a different situation there. That hasn't yet proven to be the case. And what's happened is that at least in the international eye, with healthy support from the Maduro message makers around the world, is that these sanctions are being blamed for humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. And let me knock down that canard. That is absolutely not true. The humanitarian crisis in Venezuela was created by Chavismo and was well in force, or was in force well before any sectoral sanctions were even contemplated, much less put on. And as well, the sanctions do not restrict healthcare and medicines and things like that. Now you have to have a license to get them to Venezuela, but the sanctions do not prevent that. And so this idea that the U.S. is creating COVID and all this, I mean, stuff you read and hear about is just ludicrous. But having said that, there is a public relations issue here, and so that has to be something that is recognized. And so, I think that has to be looked at to make sure that sanctions are doing what they're supposed to be doing and not creating some sort of counterproductive narrative or situation on the ground that proves to be unhelpful. At the end of the day, sanctions are a tool, and the question has to be asked, a tool to do what? So if you have the goal in mind, you can establish a sanctions regime, presumably, that will support that end game. And if the tool isn't working, or if the end game changes, or if there's some other scenario that moves the needle in some manner, then the sanctions should be reevaluated. It's not a goal in and of itself, presumably. Sanctions are a tool. But having said that, they've been very effective, in my view, to bring Maduro to the table, to the negotiations, to force him to recognize that he wants to have these released. And so what does he need to do to have them to get out from under sanctions? So they've been effective as a point of leverage, and I would be very hesitant to remove that point of leverage until and unless the Maduro regime has made significant changes on the ground that are irreversible, that lead to free and fair elections that give Venezuela a new hope for a democratic future. In terms of Iran, those connections have been on again, off again. They were first really established back in the 70s through OPEC and through the oil relationship, but they really got going under Hugo Chavez and Ahmadinejad in earlier this century. Hugo Chavez fancied himself a global revolutionary, not just a Latin American revolutionary. So he intentionally invited Ahmadinejad into Venezuela, and through the portal of Venezuela into the Western Hemisphere space. I don't think Iran was ever particularly that interested in Venezuela, but like every savvy operator, saw opportunity there, developed that relationship, not necessarily at the state-to-state level, although those are issues that have a certain political resonance, particularly in terms of sanctions busting and things like that, but through proxies for Iran, Hezbollah, et cetera. And so, you hear reports about Hezbollah and various proxy presence and training, et cetera, in Venezuela. Some of that's difficult to track down, at least for those of us who don't have access to intelligence information anymore. But you do hear those sorts of rumors. More importantly, Iran has been working over the past several months to test the sanctions regime with Venezuela and vice versa in terms of providing gasoline to Venezuela in contravention of international sanctions. And so that's something that needs to be watched. I mean, the last thing the Western Hemisphere needs is Iranian shipping coming into the Western Hemisphere and creating new challenges. To me, that's not helpful, and I'll put that in diplomatic terms, but it's not helpful. And it does provide a challenge to the United States. I mean, what can we do usefully in that context under international law and in accordance with our own security and strategic interests, et cetera. At this point, it's proven to be primarily an inconvenience. I would put it. I don't think it's become quite the strategic challenge yet, but it's certainly something to watch, and other people could certainly disagree with that. They may see a more, a stronger connection there. But having said that, it's something worth watching to be sure. And this started with Chavez, and Maduro has played it out to see where it goes. I hope it doesn't go anywhere fast.
For the wonderful questions, but thank you most of all to Eric and to this incredible audience for a robust dialogue. Eric, I think you have established that there is an incredible importance and interest that the United States has in focusing on the Americas as it looks at its grand strategic opportunities and challenges around the world. You've linked the problems that we see and the opportunities that we see in Latin America with those challenges that are typically at the forefront of what our Department of Defense and Department of State are focusing on. I want to thank you very much for your time, for your expertise, and for your eloquence on this really important issue. And I want to thank the ISW community for joining us today. And I look forward to hosting you once again in another exclusive briefing in the coming days. Thank you so much.
Well, you've been generous for the invitation. I appreciate it. I've had fun. I hope it was at least somewhat interesting, at least not boring to people, and look forward to staying engaged with you all. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.